with a conversation around millennials, human rights and economic freedom. I'm excited about this one. I'm interested and intrigued to hear the views from Lethiwe Nkosi, Network Mobilizer at Youth Capital. Good evening.
Thank you so much, Dumi, for inviting me to this conversation. I'm keen to share and hear what the other panelists have to say.
Absolute pleasure. We are also joined on the line by Nokuthula Mayisa, Trade Marketing Coordinator and WEF Global Shaper in the Tshwane Hub. Good evening to you. Hi, Nokuthula. Hi, Nokuthula.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining this panel and this conversation. I have no doubt is going to be an eye-opener, well, in the case of radio, an ear-opener for so many of our listeners. Thank you so much. Lethiwe, let me start with you. It is quite a heavy one, really, to be talking about because at times we have what is known as not so much of a freedom in terms of voices that are ventilated and an allowed space within the media when we talk about human rights and economic freedom. We often hear from the old guard. So where do you stand on millennials having a voice and expressing it quite loudly?
It is absolutely essential. And I say this not only from a personal perspective, because I'm a millennial myself, but also just from the vantage point of Youth Capital, and that we strongly believe in young people's voices being amplified, because it's through our lived experiences that we can imagine solutions to the challenges that we are faced with. As millennials, we walk to the path of, believing that if we complete school, get our qualification, overcome the challenges entailed in that, we will get a job, right?
Yeah.
That's the dream, that's the path that we imagined for ourselves. But the truth is, there are many millennials with degrees that are unemployed. And so it's essential for us to have a seat at the table to then speak to decision makers and say, these are the solutions that are needed. We didn't get what we thought we would get. The dream that was sold to us turned out to not be true. And so listen to our lived experiences, and within those, the solutions to the challenges that we are faced with.
I'm glad that you raised the matter of being sold dreams, and dreams that at this point we are not realizing as a general public in South Africa. And Nokuthula, that's where I want to bring you in. For millennials, like Lethiwe has explained, that maybe the idealistic thought would have been, yes, you go into a higher education space, you obtain your degree, and therefore you get into the labor market in South Africa. But looking at all those three elements at this time in the current day South Africa, they are all fraught still. We are not in a position where education does not have barriers to entry, especially when we look at the fees must fall asina mali issue where higher education funding is concerned. When we talk about entry into the labor market for millennials, at times you hear that there actually is no space for accommodating even more of a labor market, because corporate South Africa is currently facing economic challenges. Talk to me about what your views are on that side of things, because it really does not look like an outlook that is meant to be rosy or even fair.
Definitely. With what's basically happening with the pandemic, it's just made it even worse for millennials to get into the employment arena. And even when in employment arena, that's even just to have your seat at the table, that's even becoming difficult, The tables most of the time weren't made for us, especially Black millennials. And to also demand to have a seat there is even becoming harder. So I think for us, it's basically a time for where we have to start coming together and start finding ways on how do we create our own seats, but within this whole pandemic, how do we strive as millennials?
Interesting. We are also joined on the line now by Lethiwe Nkosi, Advisory Council Member at the Youth ICT Council. Good evening and welcome to our conversation.
Good evening. Thank you for having me tonight.
Kemo, we've spoken to Nokuthula and Lethiwe already about barriers to entry that exist and what the current status quo for South Africa looks like in terms of human rights and accommodating therefore economic freedom. Your experience with how these two even can be drawn as parallels?
with regards to barriers of entry, I do agree that there are barriers of entry that exist in the education space as well as the employment space, and these are direct human rights. And according to the Bill of Rights, according to the Constitution, these rights are, allocated to every citizen of the country, and the youth are struggling because we have barriers of entry that are infringing basically on our rights, and there's very little that seems to be done about it. We have a generation of youth that is disgruntled, that is growing impatient, and that is also losing trust in the government, based on the government being the duty bearers of these rights.
Yeah.
Young people, we have a high unemployment rate, and it seems that, we lack access to the things that we need, but there's not enough effort being done to bridge those gaps, particularly from our governments.
Those gaps indeed need to be bridged. Back to you, Nokuthula. In your view as a millennial, how are those gaps meant to be bridged? Because earlier you spoke about a voice that needs to be rising even louder in the current dispensation. But if those voices are not heard, especially on the side of questions around whether there's political will in South Africa to see a complete turnaround?
For me, I won't even lie. I feel like I am a millennium that has lost a lot of hope in government. And for me, I feel like for us to even just rise as millennials, I think we have to go back into our communities and really start building our communities. And we need to, as communities, start having a goal where we're all orientated on growing our millenniums and getting our youth developed. Because I feel like if that thing of waiting for government and waiting for opportunities, it's never going to happen. We need to start creating those communities where we want our kids in our communities to do better.
Yeah.
I think that's how we close those gaps. It's
Well
really
said.
going back to communities.
It absolutely does. And Lethiwe, coming back to you, though, on the side of, having a collective program that is going to speak and interrogate this issue of the seeming lack of political will for millennials and even those who come after this particular group to have a thriving economy in South Africa and not be sold this dream that many of us have been living through for quite some time. My question really to you is that I ask this to a lot of people, even those in political spaces and commentators, that we as a South African public are just as accountable for what is taking place in our country. And I say we are accountable because we cast the votes. The voting rights belong to us. Every single 4 years we go into those voting booths and the outcome is more or less the same, and we have not moved a needle. How do you view that particular narrative, especially because it was thought that with, millennials coming in to vote, there would be a very different shift into voting patterns in South Africa, but unfortunately that has not happened. So how do we then address that not much progress is being made, but at the same time, change is being called for?
Right. I think it's important that we have a clear vision of what that change looks like. So we have exact goals and indicators that we can hold our leaders accountable to. It's not enough for us to simply take our leaders on their word when they campaign and express their manifestos. We need to also have a clear vision of what that change looks like so that we can also hold them accountable to that. And at Youth Capital, we have an action plan for the sector that cuts across 3 focus areas: education, transitions, and jobs. And there are 10 calls to action that provide us with that vision of what kind of change we want to see. And also what kind of change we want to see across the government. Earlier you mentioned on your show that government departments work in silos, right? And you see it even during the campaigning period where different parties have different visions. And so it's important for us as a country, as a society, as young people, even more so, because we're the future leaders, to have a clear vision as to what change we want to see, a vision that will unify us across departments, across political parties. So I think that's really important. That to add to that narrative of voting, we need to have a clear vision that we can hold all departments accountable to.
Absolutely. Kimunelwe, on that front, as we talk about what it is that the general South African public votes for, and with these calls that are increasingly rising around a reform that is so desperately and drastically needed, these voting patterns, unfortunately, are not changing. And like I asked Lethiwe, in terms of where hope is maybe likely to be when we look at a change in direction around voting patterns, do you find that it's even likely to be possible? Because if we are talking about a multi-party structure in South Africa, we sometimes lose hope that we are still far from that, and the hope would have come from millennials, and now we are pinning it on those who come after your group.
Definitely. Thank you for that question. So in my view, voting patterns do have the potential to change, as I believe that the dawn of every revolution is, a people that's fed up. But I do believe, however, looking at it from the perspective of millennials and youth, we young people need to take part in active citizenship to start with. And we young people need to first organize ourselves, organize our thoughts and our desires. As it's been mentioned, that we have to have a unison vision as to what we're going to be holding these political parties accountable for. Adding on to that fact, I do believe that young people need to be within seats and at tables where policy decision making is being done.
Yeah.
Because you can't have, a particular party that has a particular age group that is not representative of the actual interests of young people. We need to have our voice raised within our communities, within our societies, but in the areas of influence that directly influence the policies that govern us today. And topping off to that, I would say that young people that can organize themselves in communities should get together and try and, lobby and fight for the access that they require. If it is access to clean drinking water in certain areas of the countries, which shockingly is still an issue, that is up to us as the community to make sure that we strive towards that. If it's access to the internet, because that's plays a big role, sped up by COVID, towards the participation in the economy currently. So how do you have students learning online? How do you have young entrepreneurs who are starting their businesses selling online if there is a bridge in the digital divide?
Exactly.
So I do feel there are a couple of pillars to look at. One is being active in the policy decision-making seat. And the other is being active citizens in unison in our communities to make that difference. I do believe with enough pressure and with enough awakening, the voting patterns will change. However, we would also be able to better hold our political parties and leaders accountable towards everything that they have set out to do.
Nokuthula, let's talk about this one, just broaden it a little bit because Kimonelu was talking about the policy decisions that are made without a certain group. Even actually, I can say that a large group of the South African public, and where millennials are concerned, what's your view in terms of how they actually doesn't sound like they are youth structures in political parties themselves, within the national government? It does, from the outside, as an ordinary South African, I hardly ever get to hear of an engagement that includes millennials in trying to come up with regulation or even proposals towards regulations that are affecting all of us in terms of the economic trajectory, as well as, an open market for labor participation.
Definitely. Just what Ganela just said, I absolutely agree with her that we need to start having millennials at this table. I mean, you're trying to solve a problem about millennials, but you don't have millennials at that table. How are you supposed to solve that problem? We know the challenges that we're facing. You need to come to us and ask us, what are our challenges? How can we sort out these challenges? And from there, we can also guide. So it can be a community that's working towards something.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I honestly believe that we need to be part of these policy creations, especially if they are for millennials.
And unfortunately, Lethiwe, millennials were, this little special egg. We had hope, again, the mood was right, like the euphoria was there, right? These millennials, they're going to change things, but now you are actually, as a group, falling under every other community within the South African landscape, which is largely ignored. How do we even answer to that? Because now all that hope is gone. Moving forward, how do we then reignite it to have the conversations that we are having currently? And I must say, on the side of some of the programs that do exist, it's not every day that we have conversations like these. Again, it means that you guys are on the outside. You are talking to yourselves on social media, but that conversation is not finding life within the broader dynamics of engagements in the country.
I hear what you're saying, and I completely agree with that. But I think the solution is going back to what I think it was Gail who said this when she talked about young people kind of organizing themselves and forming themselves, but not just young people, but I think organizations as well that have a louder voice coming together and creating a platform for young people to make their voices heard. As Youth Capital, we've created a WhatsApp group in collaboration with Youth Lab, right? And on this WhatsApp group, we encourage young people, for instance, right now to apply for the NYDA board. And just to say that the closing date is, as far as we know, the 9th of April. And so through that engagement, young people are encouraged to step forward and get their voices heard, especially in an organization like the National Youth Development Agency that is there to serve young people, create opportunities even for young people who are aspiring to be entrepreneurs. So, in conclusion, I think it's important that we collaborate. So big organizations that have a louder voice, rally young people so that their voices are amplified. It does not remain contained in their communities, but then they really get to be heard by decision makers.
Kibonelwe, as we wrap this one up, I spoke to the former SCOPA chair earlier, and one of the elements we discussed is what really is there that stands out when we talk about human rights in South Africa, because essentially not much has changed, and we saw it in recent days where students were shot at by the police. There are still deaths at the hands of the police, reminiscing a time that we thought is so far gone in South Africa, and it mimics exactly where we find ourselves still on the outside in terms of an unequal balance, even in the economic dispensation.
Thank you for that question. Quite a heavy one. So as somebody who's considered a born free in this millennial generation, as you say, we were made to believe that we're the new beacon, it's a new dawn, there's new hope. However, the gross inequalities that we still see around us are a clear indication that we definitely do need reforms, and that until, as a youth, that we have our voices expressed and we have them expressed deliberately, not much will change. I still believe that, we're sitting on old furniture in most of these structures, and therefore it normalizes the abnormal. You have millennials going into work, and because they are desperate, they are not treated the way they should be. They're not paid as well as they should be, and there are definite, obvious pay gaps, between races in companies. Yeah. And these things cannot be addressed, because if you speak up against your boss, you might be fired. You might lose your job.
You're problematic.
You're problematic. You're too loud. You're too aggressive. Calm down. And coming from a small town, finishing school in Harrismith, the gross inequalities in these small towns is still quite elaborate, aggressive.
Because you even look at those you grew up with in a small town, for instance, one who would have had an opportunity to maybe leave and find exposure elsewhere. You come back and you think to yourself, how is it that we had the same starting point in terms of age, but we are so far apart in terms of where the world takes you? And that is solely because of the unequal status quo that we perpetuate in the country.
I definitely do believe so, and it's a structural thing and a systematic thing as well. So we've got, if I can explicitly speak about how we've got banks that charge higher interest rates to young black people than they do to everybody else. We've got difficulties with accessing credit, perhaps for businesses, for investment, and we have to tirelessly sweat and fight for these things. So I do believe that we still have a lot of inequality. I'm hopeful about the youth of this generation, because we are noticing these things and we are taking steps to be active citizens and to deliberately make an effort, to change policy. I do believe that we are the drivers of that change, and I do believe that we can identify the problems. We have seen them.
Yeah.
It is now about strengthening our movement forward.
Those problems are still glaring. I wish you all the best. Thank you so much, Phenomenal Women, for having been a part of this panel. That is Gimoneilwe Patudi, Advisory Council member at the Youth ICT Council. We're also joined on the line by Trade Marketing Coordinator and WEF Global Shaper in the Tshwane Hub, Nokuthula Maisa, as well as Lethiwe Nkosi, Network Mobilizer at the Youth Capital, discussing millennials, human rights and economic freedom.